Hello, everyone. Uh, I'm here to introduce Shane Welch or Sixpoint Craft Ales. He's joining us today. Um, just on a personal note, I met Shane a bunch of months ago. I want to get that down. That's nice. So I met Shane at the New York City Homebrewers Guild a bunch of months ago. He was a guest speaker, and he brought this beer that he made. I guess he did like a wild fermentation in Brooklyn. He took some malt and just stuck it out on the fire escape, I guess, and whatever yeast blew in off the New York Harbor, just let it go and ferment and make some beer.
It was a spontaneously fermented indigenous New York City ale.
Yeah. It's taking locally sourced ingredients to like the next level.
The nth degree.
Yeah. So and then I remember you did imitation of the Brooklyn yeast. It's like, hey, I'm fermenting here.
All right.
Yeah, I'm like, this is a guy who has to speak at Google. But so basically that beer is what I like about Sixpoint. It's they're willing to experiment, push the envelope, but it's always sort of in the pursuit of a tasty beer and not just for the sake of being different or extreme or whatever. So anyway, hopefully you're all enjoying Sixpoint and Shane Welch, everyone.
Cheers. Yeah, I don't think I need that because I have this. If anyone can't hear me, then I'll just go back to using the mic. But for now, this seems like it's working. I want to first introduce myself and the company a little bit. For those of you who don't know us or maybe you never had the beer or heard of it before. But Sixpoint is like Google in the sense that we started in a garage. And that's actually how a lot of breweries got their start. Ours was in Brooklyn. It started in an 800 square foot garage in Red Hook. And to get the real story of it, though, you have to go way back. You have to go way back to when I was 2 years old. And that's where we have here. That's me when I was just a wee lad drinking beer. This is basically how it would go down. I loved the taste of beer so much that my dad at night, sometimes he would drink beer out of this mug, ceramic Stein he had. And he would drink 90% of the beer, and if he got up off the couch or if he fell asleep or whatever it was, I would come in and I would get the rest. And my mom became aware of what was going on. And instead of being horrified, she was amused. So she captured this photograph of me enjoying beer. Now, this is crazy. One of my earliest memories is beer. And there's something magical about not only the creation of it, but actually the way the flavors are fused in beer. There's physics and thermodynamics at play. There's certain resins and hops that are not soluble in water, but intense heat makes them water soluble. So you make beer in the same way that you make steel. Like you take raw iron ore and you mix it with several other metals under intense heat and pressure, and you actually fuse it together. It's very similar to how beer is made. It's a fascinating process. But the one thing about it too that's really fun is that it's alive. It's organic. So when you drink beer, you're drinking something that was, sometimes beers are filtered. The ones that you are drinking now are actually unfiltered. So they're probiotic. They have live yeast in the beer. Now, I was reading a very fascinating article. Actually, Aaron, I want to introduce my team here today too. Aaron Eckroth over here, he's done video work for us. He's an old friend of mine who actually I lived with in college, which we'll get up to shortly here when I was doing a lot of home brewing. Chris Stairbank, he does a lot of our tech work for us, our tech, web, and video work and social media. And Kristen serves as our brand ambassador in Brooklyn. Everyone here was very psyched about Google, so they wanted to come out. But if everyone came out, then no one would make the beer. So basically, I don't know if you knew this, 90% of your cells are foreign. They're not your human cells. They're actually outside agents living inside you. So bacteria that lives in your gut, bacteria on your skin, on your eyelids, only 10% of you is you, which is a crazy thought. Well, there's several leading doctors who are studying this phenomenon. People who have everything from ulcers to intestinal cramps to even sometimes colon cancer, stuff like this. And they're getting sort of microflora transplants. And I don't know if you heard about this, it's been on NPR recently, but they actually reintroduce these small bacteria and agents into your body by taking it from a healthy person and introducing it to you in a similar way that they may give you penicillin or a small dose of something and let it populate. So what I think is interesting is when you drink beer, the sheer magnitude of the cell count of what you're drinking, it's similar to like yogurt, or it's similar to eating cheese or other probiotic organisms when it's done in a craft way. You know what I'm saying? Like a homebrewed style fashion. So the key is really to bring that kind of essence back to beer, to make it alive again. So we want to do that in interesting ways, but I want to tell you a little bit more about the history. So this is me. Actually, now at this time I happen to be doing a lot of drugs, but I enjoyed every minute of it. But it was time to graduate. But that's my friend Anthony. I'm living in a co-op in Madison, Wisconsin. Yes?
Sorry to go back for a sec. Why is it only probiotic if it's made in a craft way? What would be different in beer you would normally buy?
Several things. First of all, it's almost always going to be filtered. So the filtration will take out all the fermenting agents. And then if it isn't filtered, it is most likely going to be undergoing intense pasteurization. And that'll kill everything. So when you buy beer that's kind of like coming off an assembly line, it's sterile, and it has to be sterile for shelf life. So a really long supply chain, like to give you an idea, when you get an imported beer, it'll spend 3 weeks just in customs, like at the port, in a non-refrigerated container, so they have to make sure that it's stable. So they perform those things on it to keep it from spoiling. So when you drink fresh beer out of a tank, though, you're drinking the yeast culture too. You see what I'm saying? So like back in the day, beer used to be really localized. Here's an interesting fact. About 100 years ago, before Prohibition, right? Like 10 years before Prohibition, there are actually more breweries then than there is now. And there's only like a third of the population here in the United States, so the number of breweries per capita was really high. And the two things that changed that were, one was invention of the automobile, and then two, after Prohibition and World War II, they built out this huge infrastructure in this country that was kind of based on the mobilization of World War II, so people could just dominate distribution networks. So then a brewery in St. Louis or Milwaukee could have sales in California or Connecticut, where previously that was unthinkable. So now what's interesting is we're actually reverting back to like the localized phenomenon, but it has nothing to do with the stability of the product. It has to do with the connection that people have with the product. Like they're seeking more of a connection with the breweries and the foods that they eat, which I think is really neat. Anyway, this is how it all started. So this is home brewing on a very small scale. What we're doing here is we're taking malted barley grains and running it through. You can't really see this because it's obscured by the countertop, but I had built this small mill out of spare parts. And it was based on an old spaghetti mill. So like, if you really want to make craft noodles, you get like raw semolina wheat and you run it through a mill, and then you hand roll pasta. Well, I got an old one of these really nicely preserved like Italian spaghetti mills, and I turned it into a grain mill. And we used to create beers in this way out of this house. while listening to lots of reggae. But we had a lot of fun. So flash forward, here's when I first started Sixpoint. This is in November of 2004. Taking all of these recipes, by then I had accumulated an archive of over 1,000 individual homebrews, and I wanted to turn it into full-scale productions, really only 500 gallons, so we're still talking very, very small scale. So the people here, I'm sure you can appreciate, there's a scaling effect. So you can't just like come up with an algorithm to take a homebrew recipe and then convert it into a bigger system. You lose all the nuance in translation. So each particular beer you had to develop its own algorithm for conversion. So that took a long time. For instance, like to break it down into math, if you have a 5-gallon homebrew kettle, right? And then let's say you convert it to a 500-gallon system, which is what we use at Sixpoint. That's 100 times bigger, right? But you can't just take everything and multiply it by 100, because the biggest factor is, like, remember what I said, you're fusing flavors together with heat? Well, when you increase the volume 100 times, you're not increasing the surface area 100 times. So the kettle, the volume is increasing at a faster rate than the surface area, because it's increasing in 3 dimensions and the surface area is increasing in 2 dimensions. So the ratio is getting distorted. And the reason why that makes a big difference is there's two with beer. The color of the beer, because like the more contact time you have with the kettle with the liquid, the more caramelization you're going to have and the more scorching you're going to get. And then hop extraction. Hop extraction is a term meaning like how intense of a heat, it's a third order kinetic reaction, how intense of the heat it is on the hop resins to make it water soluble and turn into hop bitterness. Translation, when you drink a beer and you get like that puckering, citrus, resiny, piney flavor, that came through that reaction. So once you start to dial these things in, though, you can kind of, there's a horrible math joke, I don't even want to go there, but you hear about the 3 statisticians who went deer hunting? You ever hear that one? All right. All right, so they're deer hunting, right? And this deer is running across the woods and they see it, right? It stops right in the middle. So the first one takes aim, fires, and it's just off to the left, right? So then the second one lifts up his rifle, shoots, and it's just off to the right. And the third one goes, "We got him." Horrible joke. All right. Anyway. You know, you can make, yeah. Cool nerds, right? So moving on. Okay, so this is like, once the reformulations were made, it was time to up the scale and start beginning the production. So in the beginning it was quite difficult because it was such a cottage industry. I don't know if anyone has taken a tour before we had shut that element down. But like Sixpoint, the original brewery was built not only in this garage, but now it's taken over this townhouse. So like we didn't have a whole lot of room to expand, so we took over 40 Van Dyke Street, which is a 2-story building. And this back room right here is a grain shed that's built on top of this roof deck. And we deliver the grain through an auger that's on the ground floor that goes up through the ceiling and lands in a gigantic, what's called a grist bin. So it's pretty MacGyvered, so to speak. In the beginning, though, we didn't have the resources to even install that auger. So all the like breweries are usually vertically integrated on the craft level, not in the conceptual sense, but in the literal sense. Like the grain room is on the top, and then the kettles are below, and then the tanks, the fermentation tanks, are directly underneath. So in the beginning, the only way to get them up there was to carry them. So we literally would call our friends on grain delivery days and we would put the grain on our backs and walk up the stairs with the grain. It sucked when, see, they were always like, we can help, and then as time went on, I'd call and they're like, oh, I'm busy. And eventually, see, here's the thing, like, your legs would start quivering, like, after a while. But then, you know, before you know it, you got thunder thighs, so. Buns of steel, right? But it was good times. Okay, so in the beginning, we'd self-distributed out of this Subaru Outback. So here's an account in Bushwick that we used to deliver to. Best story, two great distribution stories. Very first account I ever got was on the Upper East Side. And the guy ordered a keg of beer, 1 keg. So we drive all the way up there and got caught up in a traffic jam. And I couldn't find a parking spot, so I was like, I'll just temporarily park in front. And I come out, like, I sold him a keg for $100, right? I came out, I had a $160 parking ticket. I was like, damn it. So that didn't work out too well. Huh. I was going to say, was that me? It wasn't this account, but it was actually an account in Bushwick. So I pulled up the Subaru, and I was going to hit up another account after this. So I was delivering a beer inside. When I came back, the car was there, but the beer was not. So they had taken all the beer out of the car, and good thing they left the car, though. Then there was the Sixpoint Mobile. We had a delivery van. I wish I included a photo of it. That got stolen, and someone found it on the side of the road on the BQE, and they called us, and they were like, I think we found the Sixpoint van. It was kind of roughed up. So we went out there to look at it, and everything was pretty much gutted out of there, but it smelled like urine, and we think there was a guy living in there for a while. And it was funny, we called the cops because we reported it stolen a couple weeks prior. And when we called them, they didn't care. They were like, what do you want us to do about it? Like, don't you get it? We solved the crime. You know what I mean? Like, is there a reward for us? Doesn't this make you look good? You can say you did it. So this is basically how I spend a lot, like a transitional thing that I do now. This is how I actually spend a lot of my time doing these number types, crunching analytics. And that's one of the things I want to talk about with Google here, like having the opportunity to talk to you today. Like, I see you as you're like the Union Square of world's information. Like, everything passes through Google, and it's amazing. And if you look at the way that information is proliferating right now globally, it's pretty staggering, with so many people coming online and so much content being uploaded, YouTube, blogs, different things like that, and now mobile computing. So as we've grown as a business and we've added employees and data, like if you think about it, every time we brew, which is several times a day, lab report, like you take lab reports along the creation of the brew, like every 30 minutes. And then once it's in the tank, you take full lab reports and cell counts and everything every 12 hours. So if you have 14 of them in process and 3 brewing every day, we have a mountain of data that we have to now sift through. So like, I'm not carrying bags of grain, but I have to somehow find a way to make sense of all this stuff. This represents just a small snapshot of one beer, the Sweet Action, that I've been tracking. And I just developed, this is just the basic version to kind of track the consistencies or inconsistencies. But I hope it shows, like you can get an idea, like when there's an anomaly, you have to be able to spot it out, because when you brew, because it's an organic process, you'll see like everything falls within a range. And then every once in a while, something goes way out of range. And it just happens because it's a completely spontaneous process, like the fermentation. So you got to be able to track those types of things. But I have seriously some good ideas where I think like when you start talking about information sharing, I want to show you like how Google has really helped us out in different realms. So one of the things that we have, we use your suite of docs. You know, we use the spreadsheets, we use the presentation. Chris, we've been using that at our meetings. Recipe generation. So for instance, this is a Google Doc that we share with all the brewers. So I actually don't devise recipes, new recipes anymore. We have a team of brewers, like developers. And we have a Google Doc that we use. So it has this algorithm where Pete and Ian and me and Sean worked on this to determine our efficiencies with our grain and with our hops. And you generate a beer through this, and it tells you basically what proportion of different ingredients you'll need. And because it's shared, and because everyone's on there listed as like as an author, and they sign up for updates, as we brew new beers or as we make adjustments to it, everyone gets an alert. So for instance, we have a new beer coming up on Friday, tomorrow. And right before I started the meeting, I saw someone had made a change. And I was like, I looked at it, I was like, huh. You know, it's interesting when you have collaborative recipes, because sometimes people take ownership, like serious, it's almost like a creative ownership of something, and it turns into an ego thing. So we really had to let everyone know that the power of everyone looking things over is greater than any one person. And that's actually resonated, like, because usually at a brewery, incoming brewers are usually delegated to like scrubbing floors and stuff. But this way, everyone gets to participate in what's going on here. Another thing that we do, here's just like a very simple beer we did. We made a beer with Time Out New York, because they did an issue on beer and how great modern craft beer is. So we made this Time Out, it's called Time Out for a Porter. And we got this really sick yeast from Antwerp in Belgium. It was crazy. It's an ale yeast, but it fermented like a lager. It's like super clean. The only issue is it took forever. Like we were thinking it was going to ferment in like a week. It took a month. So it tied up the tank. But this is just like a really simple recipe. It got cut off at the bottom, but you get the idea. Oh yeah, this is one of the best things, collaborative press releases. Like if you have a dedicated PR person at a brewery or any small business, it's like when you write a paper, you know, you probably remember this from college or high school. When you write a paper, you'll proofread it yourself and you'll look it over 10 times and you won't notice anything. You hand it to one person and in 2 minutes they find 3 errors. So when we do press releases now, we have 3 people who, 2 of them are like trained specifically in this, and sometimes we add, Kristen gets put on there too. So Jeff, me, Kristen, and Kathy overlook all the press releases, and we make communal changes to everything too. And what's really cool too is like it's not on here, but you know where you have that chat box over on the right-hand side. So it shows you when someone opens it up, and then we'll talk about, okay, take this paragraph out and rearrange stuff. So it works out really well for that. This was one of my favorite things that you did. Like, it was a while ago, you did this feature where you can basically publish a Google Doc like as a secure HTML. So what we'll do is we created a master spreadsheet where people could get our beers in different markets. So all the people who live in New Jersey, if they want to find out where they can get their beer, our wholesaler sends us the sales report in an Excel format. I directly upload it to Google Docs. Keep only the relevant information, like the name of the account, the address, city, zip, and then publish it as HTML, and then take that and then blast it out to our network through Twitter. So within a minute, if we do a targeted blast, like sometimes we'll do a list, so we can send out an email blast or through Facebook, like only people in New Jersey. They instantly have all this information, and they love it because we used to get bombarded, like where do we get the beer, where do we get the beer, and this allows us to instantly share that information. So it's pretty awesome. One of the things that we did is we started doing a video campaign. doing just kind of zany experiments with beer. And I want to show a couple videos that we did with Aaron. Aaron produced them, and it's interesting because he kind of watched the development of me brewing in my basement and everything back in college. And then we decided to chronicle some of these stories through video. So I want to hook this up. The Clank and Stein. Is there any way we can dim the stage lights too? We're going to have audio here too, right? Okay. Huh. The majority of people on Earth have never actually tasted a Stein beer. So people are going to be able to experience a style of beer that they've never had before, and they're going to be able to taste flavors that they've never had before, because this process isn't being done anymore. So I'm Shane Welch, president, founder of Sixpoint Craft Ales here in Brooklyn, New York. This brewery was born out of an abandoned garage here in Red Hook, Brooklyn. So we wanted to make a Stein beer, but our intention with it was very different than the people who originally made Stein beer. These ancient brewers would heat up rocks till they were glowing red hot and put them into the beer. That was the only way that they figured out how to get beer up to a rolling, consistent boil. And see, you need that to make beer. They used to literally have to put the fire into the beer. Now, we have the modern technology. What we're gonna do though is channel these ancient breweries to bring the fire into the kettle and recreate what an original Stein beer is like. But we only have a vague notion of how it's made. We know that you put hot rocks into beer, but that's really about it. There's no instruction manual, there's no blueprint, but quite frankly, all that did is entice us even more to do it. So luckily we have Amaram, who's a foundry right here in Brooklyn, run by a guy named Florin. He's kind of behind the scenes, but he's a total guru when it comes to this type of stuff. This foundry is like no other place on Earth. It's almost as if it had been picked up and airlifted out of Soviet Russia, and they dropped it right in the middle of Brooklyn. He's got this enormous steel structure with girders, and there's pigeons hanging out in the top, like an old junkyard dog in the corner. So we're gonna try to source different rocks, heat them up until they're scalding red hot, and place them in water to see what happens. And see, that's where the working relationship is with me and Dave.
All I could think about was, how are we gonna make this beer and not kill anybody? You're looking at between 800 and 1200 degrees. There's some dangerous science behind this Stein beer. The first rock we tried was granite. We did an initial test with a wood-burning stove. We could tell right away that the granite was disintegrating. We decided to use a rock called basalt, which is basically a lava rock. And we thought that this might handle the heat better than granite. There's no question that it weakens, but it doesn't disintegrate nearly as much as the granite.
We should have some type of a basket, right, that we can heat the rocks up in and then immerse the basket into the wood.
So the real challenge was to figure out how we were going to take 1,000-degree rocks and boil 500 gallons of beer.
So although it's an industrial process, we see brewing as an art. And one of the cool things about this is we have a working relationship with the Modern, which is a restaurant that is actually connected to the Museum of Modern Art. And they see what we do as art as well. So we wanted to partner up with them to produce this Stein beer. My friend Aaron, who is the manager there, he was really intrigued by this idea. So then that got the ball rolling. And now Sixpoint and the entire staff of the Modern psyched about this whole project and wanting to participate in it.
I swear, go crazy. She got jumper cable lips. She got sunset on her breath. Now I inhale just a little bit. Now I got no fear of death now. Oh, it's the magical mystery kind. Oh, must be a lie. Bye-bye to the too good to be true kind of thoughts. Oh, I could die. Oh, now I could die.
The cool thing about it was not only are you doing an engineering exploration, you're doing a new expose on the flavor impact on this. In other words, the process itself would lend a flavor that you could normally not capture if you were to just make beer the conventional way. So that to us was a very potent combination. You could use the same exact ingredients, and because you're changing the process, it can have a remarkably different impact on the final flavor. And that's really kind of the whole fun in the experimentation of craft beer. No matter where you work at Sixpoint, everyone agrees that we always have to be true to that spirit of creativity and try to continually push the boundaries and the frontiers of making beer, making recipes, doing experiments. As we make the Clankenstein, this is just sort of the next chapter of Sixpoint. How about another film? I got one more for you. This one is, so after the first video that we did, we decided to be a little more avant-garde. So this one's let me give you a little background on this. What we wanted to do is a sort of an expose on different brewing cultures around the world. So really the genesis of Sixpoint was this home brewing that I'd done, but then I circumnavigated the globe and visited all these different breweries in different countries. And what I found was that people all over the world have beer in some, either it's a very refined scientific way like you see in Germany, or sometimes it's very crude, but it's the basic premise. And I had this idea that it's really kind of the basic premise of all culture in the literal sense, because culture, when you break down the etymology of the word, means to farm, to cultivate, right? So if the first crops that people were cultivating were cereal grains for beer or for fermented beverages, then beer is the cornerstone of culture. Well, there's a group of people that have a very mysterious heritage with beer, and these are the berserkers. So these Norse warriors were really into beer. And they have kind of a very romanticized, sometimes distorted perception of like what their culture was actually like. They were pretty amazing people. Yes, they had, of course, the raids, and everyone knows about the raping and the pillaging and all that stuff. But they were incredible metalsmiths, and they were excellent shipbuilders. They had a high degree of craftsmanship in what they did. Some of you may have read the sagas. One thing that's mysterious is their beer that they made. The reason why is because they had not a nomadic culture, but because they're going on these raids, they don't really have a permanent place to stay. So they had to build mobile breweries. And think if you land wherever they are, Ireland or whatever, like the first thing they got to do is the designated brewer has to go out and source whatever cereal grains they can find, or berries or fruits or whatever. Turns out they used to make all different types of crazy beers, some with mushrooms, and they used to make like beverages that would make them go berserk. So they're famous for whipping themselves up into a frenzy before they would go on their raids or whatever. Now historical evidence shows that that wasn't because they were just simply excited. It's because it was chemically triggered through these beers. So I thought that if you look at the entire history of beer, you can't leave this chapter out. You know what I mean? Now, they're kind of crazy people, obviously, but it's pretty cool to know that if we be frank, people drink beer because it can taste delicious, but you want to relax. You want the effect, right? Well, it's a very highly regulated product, but if you take the entire course of human history, that's not the only chemical that was in beer that people were drinking. If you look at, I don't know if you've ever read of like the ancient Greeks, the mathematicians and the philosophers, they used to drink very interesting fermented beverages. I don't know if you've ever heard about like some of their math societies they had. And they used to drink basically beverages that were fermented grains and psilocybin, which is crazy, right? So these are people who are like developing the foundation of Euclidean geometry, right? Stuff that everyone learns now in middle school and high school. And they're doing it over these beverages. I think that's a really fascinating part of history. So we kind of did a comical take on the berserkers. I'll just leave it at that. I just see it. When the berserkers were coming in on raids, they had an impact before they even started to do their damage, just by their pure visual appearance. These people are foaming at the mouth. They're wide-eyed, they look completely crazy, and they're kind of in a trance. Once you see the appearance of someone like this, you realize that you're in for some deep shit. We don't really care about the violence or the stuff like that. That's not what we're interested in. We're interested in these warriors and their drink. It was a beverage created by the medicine men of fermented grains and berries and herbs and mushrooms. And so the beer is what's important to us. It's the brewing heritage of these people. They had their own beer, their own culture. And what we decided to do was to create a beverage that had the fermented grains, but it also had this extra ingredient in it. A lot of breweries do collaborations with another brewery. What interests me, though, is doing a collaboration with someone who's not in the brewing industry at all. Well, coffee brewing industry.
Great coffee doesn't just happen. It's not just an accident. It starts with us looking for very unique and/or heirloom varieties of coffee. driving through a valley and seeing maybe a dark green spot up on a mountain of coffee. You know, that's where I'm going. That's where I'm headed up there, you know. People are finding that coffee can just be as complex as the finest ale or the finest wines out there.
I think a lot of people, when they think coffee beer, the first thing they would think is like a stout or a porter. We decided to take a different approach. We were going to make a lager beer. We decided to do a Bock, actually, because Bock is totally underrepresented. They've been drinking it in northern Germany and Scandinavia for a long time. And we were thinking, okay, because it's going to be a cold fermented beer, let's use cold brewed coffee and integrate it into a cold brewed beer.
The flavor, the character, there's less, if not no acidity. Yeah, cold brew is definitely the way to go, at least in my mind, with brewing a coffee beer.
Cold press was the essence of what we had to do, but it was really hard to get that into the system. The only way we could figure out how to do that was as brewers. So that's when the mechanical came in. Now the mechanical is sort of this homemade mini conical fermenter named after Ian McConnell. He resurrected this piece of equipment, so we dubbed it the mechanical.
Okay, there. There's Pendleton Wool. Guatemala Pical and Hairto from Huehuetenango, very close to the Mexican border. Undisputedly one of the best coffees in the world. No milk, no sugar, no cream. This is the guy right here. This is the guy.
Well, we know where it comes from. Let's find out where it's going.
You want to start brewing?
So it gave us the opportunity to mash beer with Dwayne, mash the actual Berserker Bock beer, and then we also got to mash the actual coffee beans. We actually did it in the exact same process that you would with beer.
That aroma is intoxicating.
We're not trying to get fermentable sugar out of the coffee, but we did need to make a mash. The only difference is, rather than letting the mash sit for an hour, we had to let the mash sit for about 8 to 12 hours. So the two cold press elements gave it a full court press, so to speak. And then from there, we were able to rack that cold press extract into our kegs. Then we were able to integrate them directly into the beer afterwards. And Berserker Bock was on.
We're jaded, so we think we need more coffee, but we want to take this up to 11.
There's kind of a long history of debate and tension right now about putting caffeine into alcoholic beverages. The Berserker Bock integrates the caffeine through natural coffee beans, and because it's being integrated naturally, it's totally legitimate. We take responsibility with this beer. It's up to us to deliver it in a way that's calibrated so that the dosage and the potency is perfect. The ancient Berserker beer, it had a certain effect, and those effects were relevant for that period of time. Zoom forward now, what are you going to grab from your surroundings? Who are you going to collaborate with? Are you going to collaborate with the local medicine man? Are you going to collaborate with the local coffee roaster? The energy and the spirit can be the same, but the effects and the recipe and the technique can be reinterpreted in a modern setting. Beer is always going to be here. If it was here 1,000 years ago, it's going to be here 1,000 years from now. And who knows what they'll put into their beer then. But it's still going to be the Berserker beer.
Okay, so we do this ongoing series called, thank you. We do this ongoing series called the Mad Scientist series. And what it is like you saw those home brews from way back in the day. As you get bigger, people demand these like core flavors. So like if we run out of Bengali Tiger or Sweet Action or Righteous Ale, people freak out. So a lot of our energy goes into maintaining inventory on those. But instead of like pigeonholing ourselves into the Sweet Action Brewing Company or whatever, we made a commitment to constantly come up with new beers in two different ways. On a production and public level, we have the Mad Scientist series. So every 2 months, you have a new beer. And it has to be done in that vein, where it's kind of taking science as a foundation, but then irreverently creating mad scientist type beers. So we're currently on Mad Scientist number 6. This is something we launched last year in December. Now, what we also do is we do an ongoing experimentation that actually lasts the entire week. Yes?
So would that beer be allowed now? I know there was this crackdown on caffeinated alcoholic beverages with Four Loko and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. That's why we put that in there almost, I know I'm abusing the term, but posthumously. Basically, the video was already done. And then Aaron and I were shooting by the way, all that footage was from Prospect Park. He literally called up 2 of his friends and had them dress up like crazy people and captured them on film. But we were like, shit, they're Four Loko, but it was another one too, and they're really cracking down. And it's crazy because someone can walk into a bar and slam 3 espressos and then drink a beer, but you can't drink them simultaneously. And if done right, they can go together really well, not from a chemical perspective, but a flavor perspective. Because like a stout beer or like roasted bitter beers can go great with hops and barley malt. So the way that you can do it legitimately is you have to use whatever the source of the caffeine is, so whether it's chocolate or coffee or cola nuts or whatever you're using, as long as you use the raw form of that and you use it in the brewing process, it's okay. But you can't make a tincture, and you can't just purchase raw caffeine and then infuse it into what you're making. So the FDA and the TTB, or also known as the ATF, has basically determined that the dosage of caffeine in its naturally occurring form is fine, but when you amplify that artificially, then it's not good. But that's really kind of a crock, because when we made, I don't know if you've ever had like Speedway Stout. It's a beer from AleSmith in San Diego. Like, it's so intensely caffeinated that half of one bottle is too much for me, at least. Like I can't consume it. I get uncomfortable and have nightmares. But I wanted to talk about another thing that we do that I know you have here. Allowing people to like explore their creative avenues. So the 20% thing that you have, we have that with our brewers. So instead of working all week long to brew production beers, one of those days you brew just to brew. And we have a brewery within a brewery. So our 15-barrel brew house also has a very small 10-gallon system. And on that system, right now, someone's making a beer. That beer will never be commercially sold, because we make we literally make 2 kegs every time we make a batch on there, so that's it. But what it does is, first of all, it's fun, and second of all, we get to taste a lot of great beers, and then third of all, perhaps one day it will spin off into a beer. Now, because we make so many of these now, we have an archive that's growing, so we need an outlet. So there's the kegerator at the brewery, which a lot of them flow through. But I want to bring some in here. I want to bring in some of these beers to Google. All right. I think we should totally do it. But I also want to talk about this crazy idea I had. I think we can do this. And I think we can do it really well. There's a lot of people here who like beer, and there's a lot of people who actually homebrew. So what about if we do an idea like I showed you before, where if we have a template and then we invite all of you as collaborators, right, on the Google Doc, and we devise like a wiki brew, right, and we refine it and we get it down to exactly the way that people are looking for with their input, and then we launch it. And we can maybe start out with like a small draft version that we first test out here at the Google draft system. And then maybe over a couple permutations, if we really dial it in, we could launch it in a can. And I was like, this would be a really fun collaborative project to test the extent of how you can work together with people who maybe not necessarily be professional brewers, but may have insight on a grand scale, like crowdsource a recipe. So I started thinking about, there's actually people who have made homebrews in the spirit of Google, and I don't know if you knew about this, but you go to homebrews, do you know the Maltese Falcons? Anyone know who they are? Who else is a nerd in the room? Okay, they're like this iconic homebrew club in California. They made one of their brewers there had made a really good Google beer that I tasted at a homebrew competition. And I was like, it kind of spawned this idea. I was like, this would be really awesome. So the Google brew, I've seen people who do it, and I'm like, I'm not really feeling this one though. And then I saw this one, some guy had this. I mean, they took the the color scheme and the font, and they're trying to do it. I'm like, that's still not good. You need some style, right? So someone did a Google buzz. So, interestingly, thing about this beer is it launched with a whole bunch of fanfare, and then it totally flopped. Yeah. +1. So we're talking the Sixpoint Google Brow. No, what I was thinking about is doing an actual wiki, a real wiki style brew, where we seriously, we come together with, it's an experiment of trying to funnel and trying to hone a vision of a lot of people into a single recipe. And perhaps it never gets to that type of a development stage, but I think at the very least, trying to develop a recipe that we could pour on draft, that we would be able to deliver you kegs of a beer that was crowdsourced, a recipe, and actually served here at your at the cafeteria or the tasting room or whatever you call it. So I started thinking about that. I think it'd be really awesome, because the one thing I was concerned about is when people start thinking about wacky ideas, like how to actually have an editorial on that. So perhaps with all the bright people here, there's a solution for that. But I'm serious about this. I think we can knock it out of the park here. So excited about it that it made me think of Teen Wolf. But that's all. Seriously, I have for you today. But if you have Q&A, if you want to ask me any questions about the presentation or history, yeah.
Actually, have you come up with the?
Where
We're
is
trying to do
there it
beers
is.
with wild yeast these days. Now that you're larger scale.
Yeah, the one that we did that Brian was referring to was done only half a year ago. So, but mass producing them is hard. So the one that we did was on a very small scale. The other difficult thing about wild yeast beers is they take a long time to mellow out. So typical production beer, like one of these, can be brewed and fermented and packaged in about 3 weeks. Spontaneously fermented beer will take usually over a year, because when it's raw, it's really raw, and you get intense sulfur and intense. It almost tastes like rotten, you know. And that's what's really funny about that whole process, like beer, like cheese and these other fermented agents. It's really what it is. It's controlled spoilage, if you think about it. So without getting too John Denver-y, too hippy dippy. If you think about like all life, the nutrients get recycled, right? So as things pass through the system, the ecosystem, decomposing organisms like yeast and certain bacteria, in the initial stages as it's moving out of a rotting or a decomposing entity, it's really raw and it's not palatable. But it's in its life trajectory, there's a moment of time, a window, when it's delicious, when it's really savory. And then actually it may slip out of that window again and then become inedible or offensive. So the key a lot of times with brewing is the same as being a jazz musician. It's timing. You have to pick the right time when to capture it, when it's hitting its zenith for its flavor, and then get it out to people so they can enjoy it then. But it's kind of like fruit at the supermarket too. Like they don't pick it right, because if they picked it right, by the time it was on the shelf, it'd be overripe. So with live beer like this, you kind of capture it right before it hits its peak. So by the time it gets there, it's at its peak. That's the cool thing about when you package it live. Other breweries do this too. Like I'm sure you heard of bottle fermented or can fermented. It's actually when there's a tertiary fermentation in the bottle. Any other questions about it? No.
So I was just wondering about your decision to start canning.
Mm-hmm.
Did this result in a lot of process changes? Like, is it different making a canned beer than making a draft beer? Is the recipe the same? Are there any additional steps in making the beer? And how do you find that it changes how it turns out?
Interestingly, not a whole lot, because this canned beer will be identical to the draft, because it's literally pulled out of the same exact tank, the same exact batch. However, due to the size of the serving vessel and the force of the carbonation with draft beer as opposed to the natural fermentation or the static fermentation that's in a can, it will taste different, but it's the exact same beer. For instance, you go to some bar and they'll set their draft system to 20 psi, and then the guy across the street might be at 15, and then maybe that guy doesn't, like let's say this woman owns an account and her tap line's perfectly clean, and then across the street some dude doesn't clean his tap lines in years. So there's that variable too. That's one thing I actually like about cans, as opposed to, like, draft is great when it's fresh and it's well maintained. The problem is that you don't have control over the account. And a lot of, they maintain pretty high standards in New York. But there are a few that you taste and you know it's off. You know that there's something funky going on. Like when you drink one beer and you have a horrible hangover the next day, you know that there's something other than beer in that line.
Is there any particular bar in the neighborhood? The best Sixpoint experience?
The best? Okay, I thought you were going to ask me for the ones that are rotting from the inside. You ever see a cancer-ridden lung? No, but you wouldn't believe. Actually, I got to tell a funny story about that. So before, I don't want to disclose or disparage any account, but I can tell you a history about that I've had with this. When I first started out as a brewer, I was in college. I was working at this place called the Angelic Brewing Company in Madison, and I was working for, like, I think minimum wage at the time was $4.25. Maybe it was $5.20. I think it was actually $4.25 in the mid to late 90s, and then it went up to $5.25. Anyway, it wasn't a whole lot, so I needed to make some scratch. And on the weekend, I had access to all the brewing chemicals, and I was aware of the processes and stuff. So what I did is I offered local bars to go around and basically clean their tap lines. And it was really good because I could go out and do it at a really good rate, and I was effective, and I'd wake up on a Saturday morning and do it. The other thing about Madison is, like, a lot of all the restaurants and bars are concentrated on a single street called State Street. And so, like, you could literally go up and down the block and hit all of them. So some of them hadn't cleaned their lines in a long time. It might have been years, I don't know. But I convinced them to do it. And one of them I remember, I hooked up a hot solution of sodium hydroxide, which is a very intense caustic. It basically, chemically what it does is it just breaks down carbon bonds. And if you pour it on your skin, it'll feel slimy, because what it's basically doing is it's turning your skin into soap. So it's a surfactant, right? Well, it's nasty stuff, but if you have anything living in the tap line, it'll dissolve it. Well, I poured hot caustic through one of these lines, and I had a bucket like a stainless steel bucket that I used to use to catch the discharge. And this one, it literally shot out a black tapeworm. Like, it was a mold culture that had grown in the entire line. And it wasn't coming out. I was like, why is it sputtering, you know? And then all of a sudden it went, phoom, and I saw this thing in there. It looked like a loogie, so to speak. I was horrified. And I told my friends, I'm like, don't go to this bar. And they'd ask why. I say, just don't. And if you do, drink bottled beer. So for those reasons, now they're a really good place to actually drink. They always have 4 of our beers on tap. There's a place in Brooklyn called Prime Meats. It's on Court Street. They clean their tap lines every week, which is pretty unprecedented for most places. When you do that, they're impeccably clean, you know. But yeah, if you ever walk into a place like a dive bar and it has a weird vibe, or because like, you know how dive bars kind of came in vogue now, where people intentionally dirty things up to be cool. That's cool to an extent, but there's hygienic purposes here, like tap lines. So if you ever have that feeling, I highly suggest canned or bottled beer. Even stay away from the cocktails, because that's a whole nother story. Right.
As far as like, you know, nowadays seems to be like a big craft beer renaissance. And the numbers are shooting back to like pre-prohibition, but you know the whole distribution difficulties, competing with like multinationals and national brewing companies. How do you compete against the other craft breweries, like wanting to support that whole movement, and at the same time trying to maintain a business against the bigger guys?
It's an excellent question. Luckily, there hasn't been a lot of cannibalism in our industry, and it's mostly collaborative instead of competitive. And the reason why is that we're generally fending off attacks from very large, as you put, multinational brewers. So it's just, first of all, it's strategically wise to band together with smaller brewers. But the other thing is like, brewers are all kind of, in general, craft brewers, they're all, it doesn't matter, like, you break people down demographically, age, you know, religion, sex, whatever. All of that melts away when you're a craft brewer, because you're all kind of cut from the same cloth. You come to these conventions and you realize, hey, you're a nerd? I'm a nerd too. Wait, you like hops? Dude, I'm so into hops. And it breaks down a lot of barriers, especially after a couple beers. And but the funny thing is that it's hard to do something to want to crush or dominate or whatever traditional business aggression you would apply to that. To do that to someone like that, because you're on the same vibrational level. They're practically you're part of the same clan. So you almost have like this natural kinship as a craft brewer. And luckily, we are in a time right now too where there's excess demand. So even though there's a lot of breweries now back on the market, many of them can't make it fast enough. So there's really no reason to do that to another brewer. But you bring up a good point, because perhaps in the future there'll be saturation. And at that point in time, will the spirit of collaboration devolve into one of Lord of the Flies or something like that? I don't know. We'll see, but I certainly wouldn't want to be the one instigating that. You know what I mean? It would be really destructive to the whole spirit of the industry. It's pretty pure right now. I hope it doesn't get tainted. I'm confident it won't. Because the leadership right now, a lot of the leadership in the industry, they serve as moderators, so to speak. There's pretty good examples. Lately, there's been intellectual property fights. You can imagine if there's 2,000 breweries, and let's say you have an average of 20 brands, I mean, do the math. You're looking at like 40,000 names. Occasionally, someone's going to have the same name for a beer, right? What are you going to do when you're selling the same name beer in the same market, or maybe even in the same bar? Like, one brewer is going to claim, I was here first, or one brewer is going to say, I have the trademark on this and you don't. And the guy may retort, yeah, but I've been brewing this beer for 15 years. I don't have a trademark, but I have established use in this market. So they get into these legal battles now, and it's happening. So we are seeing like little tremors of that, so to speak. But then you have cases like Avery Brewing Company in Russian River had the exact same name for a beer. And like someone started to butt heads, and they're like, we need, you need to stop, you need to stop. So then they, instead of making, going to court, they instead made a new beer together. It was called Collaboration, not Litigation. So that's just like kind of a creative way. And actually, if you think about it, what did they do? They took all the hoopla and all the tension, and they redirected the press, the negative press, and turned it into like sort of a PR stunt to elevate both the brands. So I like that creative solution better.
So how did you get the nerve to start it up, and then how'd you put together your team?
It was done without any tact or skill at all. It was actually probably one of the, without taking in 20/20 hindsight, like one of the worst decisions that I probably made. Undercapitalized, underfunded, lack of knowledge, lack of business savvy. And the only thing that kind of kept it going was basically pure determination to make it work. But what happens is, you may notice this, that anytime you have genuine passion for what you do, you turn into a magnet. And when people encounter it, they get inspired by what you do. So really what it's been is all these amazing people that I get to work with every day, they have taken everything to a higher level. And I feel like I don't want to say I don't contribute anymore, because I know that I'm a driving force by what we do, but it's really my staff that really does everything. And I'm just totally grateful for everything that they do. And what's crazy is it has a multiplier effect. So the bigger it gets, the wider reach it has. So then when people encounter it, they can feel the energy of what's going on. So then it creates an even stronger magnet. And when it was small, it was like sort of cell division. It was just 1 and then 2 and 4 and 8. And so that happened for years, but now it kind of hit a critical mass. So one of the things we're trying to do, you heard it at Google first. We're actually trying to turn the brewery in Red Hook into like this, literally, well, in a figurative sense first, like a radioactive magnet for, you come down there and it'll be like an incredible beer experience. So a lot of thought is going into how now the renovation of the facilities, the design, the concept, the intention. But I want to have the ability for people to come down there and witness what goes on there every day culturally, and because it's sensational. And putting it, like trying to envelope the whole thing into a single experience that you could walk out of there and have a real distilled idea of what this whole craft beer thing is like. So we're hoping to have that complete. It's going to take all of next year probably, but hopefully early 2013. I totally want the entire team at Google to come down. We need like several buses or maybe an ocean liner. I don't know how many people work here now. You don't measure it in rooms, you measure it in floors. It's like, how many floors do we have now?
So you mentioned, and I thought we should ask, is have you ever done a mushroom beer? Maybe.
We've done several mushroom beers. First, we have a beer called Stemmenkappen, which was debuted in the Black Crowes did a concert at Summer Stage a few years ago. It debuted there to rave reviews. But that was a one-time deal that has not been recreated. But then we did a beer with chanterelles 2 years ago. Now, what's interesting about making beer with mushrooms is that you basically do that when you make beer anyway, because yeast is fungus. But the difference is, do we have any, seriously, anyone here into mycology? Anyone? No? A little bit? Right. So I had this crazy thought too, because I've been reading up a lot on this, because it's very similar to yeast. So you know mycelium? All right, so a quick breakdown on this type of fungus. It's super powerful. Conceptually, it was very powerful thought for me. Like if you look at the way the internet is developing, or the web, and now with cloud computing, you have all this information that's actually going up into the cloud. And if everyone has access to it, it's like not an infinite amount of knowledge, but an expanding universe of knowledge that you can retrieve at any time. And it's almost like having eyes all over the world, or being in every single library that you could ever walk into. And that's a really powerful thought if you think of humanity moving forward into the future as this thrust, right? Like maybe 200 years ago we were powered by the Industrial Revolution, and that took us to new heights. But then we found the problems with that. Like it poisoned our environment. It created incredible wealth disparities, right? But now, if you look at equal liberalized access to information, and you think of the potential of that, if we can do that, it's pretty amazing. The model for that is actually in nature with mycelium. So when you walk into a forest, right? You ever notice, if you ever walked on a path in a forest, you may walk there every day, or maybe you walk by your parents' house or on your way to school or whatever it is. One day there'll be a little white, it looks like a spider web on the floor of the ground, and then there might be a little toadstool that pops up. So when mushrooms grow like that, the first thing that they do, some species, is they create a blanket mycelium on the forest floor. And what it is that it first starts out as one cell layer thick, so really, really small, microscopic, you can't see it. As it grows, it gets thicker and it looks like a big white spider web. And sometimes they range to only a small little patch, or a microscopic little patch. But they found mycelium in Washington State that are sometimes 50 miles wide, or sometimes 200 miles wide. Huge patches of forest that are covered by these blankets. And what's interesting about it is they found, and when they've done studies on them, that what it is it's basically a neural network. So the mycelium, or the fungus, has to determine where it's going to plant its roots, or where it's going to grow, so it can disperse its spores, so it can reproduce. And it's going to tell, the entire network is going to tell it where's the moisture, where's the nutrients, where's the decomposing organism, and it's going to concentrate it in that area. So it has an intelligence. what a single cell doesn't have a whole lot of intelligence. A single cell is pretty helpless, but the entire network collectively has extreme intelligence because it knows exactly what's happening in the entire forest because it created a one cell layer thick blanket. So what's cool, they've done crazy experiments with this. When you're walking down a path in a forest and you step on mycelium, you send out a very small tremor in that web, and it goes throughout the entire forest. So literally, the forest knows that you're inside it, right? So when I think of like what's happening with the web or the internet, it reminds me of that. Because if we connect everyone, and someone comes online and they can distribute information, it becomes a fountainhead and a resource for everyone else. And now it's just a matter of organizing it. Now it's just a matter of harnessing all of that information and using it properly. That's what I really like when I go into Google Labs. You see something like the flu tracker. I love that thing. Like there's so many cool things there's so much information out there. And it's just a matter of compiling it. So I'm off topic. What was the question? We're talking about mycelium. How the hell we get talking? Oh yeah, mushroom beer. So yeah, we've done several mushroom beers. And here's what's crazy about mushroom beer too. When you chop up like a mushroom, if it's dried mushroom, or even if it's fresh, wet mushroom, some of them have spores in it. Some of them have millions of spores. So when you condition with it, right, and you put it into the bottle and you bottle ferment, it'll actually start fermentation again in the bottle. So it'll consume the malt sugar, right? And we had beers that we kept in the bottles with mushrooms in them in the walk-in cooler in the dark. And came back several months later, and when you held the bottle up and you shined a light on it, there were little stems and caps, like mushrooms growing off the bottom of the bottle. To the point where like you would pour it into a glass, and at the end of it, when you'd swirl it, these little button mushrooms would come out on the top of the head of the beer. It's crazy, right? Delicious though. Tastes earthy.
So you have so many different kinds of beer, they all taste great. I'm wondering personally, when you decide to drink a beer, what goes through your mind? I mean, do you tend to go to the same beer over and over, or do you crave difference?
Crave difference. Similar to like, I don't know, you do an intense workout or you go running or capoeira or whatever you do. Like sometimes when I come back, I crave orange juice for some crazy reason. But I think your body has an intelligence of what you're looking for. For me, like with beer, it's hops. So like once you develop an affinity for that flavor, you crave it. It's crazy. I was in Germany for a week visiting breweries there. There's no IPA at all. It's all like pills and dunkel and stuff. And after a week, I was jonesing for an IPA. It was almost an obsession, you know? So I think you activate parts of your palate with certain beers, and then once it's activated, you seek that out. But I think it's seasonal too. So like right now in the summer, when it's like ridiculously hot, I want really dry, well attenuated beers. Not a lot of sugar, but like a lot of carbonation and a lot of bitterness. And in the winter, like more fuller bodied beers. Beers with less carbonation, beers that you can sip and savor. So some of it has to do seasonal things too.
So is all your beer brewed from the facility in Red Hook?
No, we have two brewing. We used to have three, and now we have two brewing facilities that we make beer at. We make beer in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and also 40 Van Dyke Street in Brooklyn. To give you an idea of the sort of the meteoric growth that has basically happened in the past year, or really the past 18 months. What we make now in about 2 weeks, we made in all of last year. So it's gotten it's come out of nowhere. It's really getting difficult to manage. So now we've had to pump the brakes a little bit, but we just simply reached a point where we couldn't keep a cap on what we were doing. And it's exciting, but at the same time, I was just talking to Brian before we came in here, we need to pump the brakes because it's getting a little bit out of control. And I don't like that. I like having a connection with everything that's going on. And it's starting to get to the point where that's becoming very hard. That being said, we only have the beer in 5 states currently, so it's still very tight. And what's interesting is 90% of all the beer is still consumed, not only in the 5 boroughs, but just in Brooklyn and Manhattan. So if you look at the tight distribution footprint, it's an 18-mile radius where 90% of all the volume of our beer is consumed, which is pretty awesome. And I like it that way too, for now. Any other ideas, thoughts? Oh yeah.
I think we should wrap up over time.
We're way over, aren't we?
No big deal. Shane Welch.
All right, thank you.